Great. Well, hi. Good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining Arlington County's public webinar for the Green Building Incentive Program update. My name is Paul Roman, and I'm the Green Building Program Manager for the county. I sit on the county's Arlington's Initiative to Rethink Energy team, or AIRE for short, in the Office of Sustainability and Environmental Management. Tonight, I'm joined by my colleague, Vicky Kieschel. Vicky is an architect and consultant for the county's Green Building Program. And I'm also joined by Jenna Peabody, who is AIRE's Energy Programs Outreach Specialist. And in attendance is Dimitri McBride, the Office of Sustainability's Bureau Chief. Tonight, Vicky and I will be presenting the proposed update to the county's Green Building Incentive Program. This includes the context and goals, the history of the program, the evolution of industry standards, and the summary of the GBIP proposal update. Also, during tonight's webinar, we'll be holding a 30-minute Q&A session after the debrief. And within a week after this webinar, the county will be launching the public comment period online. This comment period will be open for 30 days, and there will be an announcement made and a link sent out to tonight's attendees. Again, thank you all for joining. We look forward to presenting the update as well as answering any questions at the end. So with that, let's move on to the agenda. Jenna, next slide, please. So here's the agenda for tonight's meeting. We'll start with the Arlington community context and goals. We'll look at the history and evolution of the GBIP and industry standards, and then we'll review the GBIP updates and proposal. Jenna, next slide, please. So let's start with the Arlington community context and goals. Next slide, please, Jenna. So you may already be familiar with the county's Fast Facts profile. This one is from 2024, but if you're not familiar with this, it provides metrics for various categories, such as people, housing, and transportation. I'm not going to read each of these Fast Facts from the Arlington profile, but in relation to sustainability, it does tell a story. When you're looking at transit, we're served by multimodal transportation that connects us to several diverse uses in the community, whether that be within walking, biking, or bus or rail distance. The county is also the smallest self-governing county in the U.S., occupying slightly less than 26 square miles, which also means we're densely populated. So with a population of around 67% living in planning corridors, and when you narrow this percentage down in combination with the Arlington housing stock, you're looking at 72% of our housing stock units being multifamily. So when you're thinking about the current built environment in relation to the previously mentioned metrics, when you're combining the aspects of green buildings, sustainability, and the post-pandemic world, it creates a story and also a sense of urgency in how the county adapts to the marketplace. And as we know, the county's green building program is the primary tool to lower carbon emissions in the private sector. So as we benchmark metrics like those in the Fast Facts profile, we'll be able to address how the county continues to lower energy use intensity and create healthy internal environments among the private building stock. Jenna, next slide, please. As part of Arlington County's community goals, the overarching sustainability and energy goals are addressed in the county's Community Energy Plan, or CEP, as it's referred to. If you're not familiar with the CEP, it is Arlington's long-term vision for transforming how we generate, use, and distribute energy in the county, and it sets Arlington on a path to becoming a carbon-neutral community by 2050. The private building sector plays a significant role in the Community Energy Plan. If the intent is to become a carbon-neutral community by 2050, then the GBIP will continue to be used as a primary tool in addressing energy efficiency and building performance. For example, various goals, such as improving energy efficiency by 30 to 40% by 2050, and 50% more efficient than the Virginia Code for new buildings, are some of the items encapsulated in the CEP, which leads me to my next point, and we'll address this further when we summarize the GBIP and the proposal. But as a teaser, we're not only looking at new construction in this update, but we're also looking at existing buildings and adaptive reuse or conversion, so we can address energy efficiency, ongoing performance, and carbon sinks in our existing building stock, while also economically revitalizing our neighborhoods. Jenna, next slide, please. Here we have Arlington's 2016 greenhouse gas emissions inventory. The main point to note here is that over half of the emissions inventory is produced from the building sector, making this the largest source of emissions in the county, with commercial buildings being the largest component. And as we can see from the figure, yes, from 2007 to 2016, the overall emissions, but specifically in this case, the building sector, have continued to decline. But as mentioned prior, if the county plans to become a carbon neutral community by 2050, the existing properties within this sector and subsector need to be addressed. The GBIP needs to continue to focus on the stringent energy performance and carbon reduction in new construction. Jenna, next slide, please. Here's the further breakdown of the countywide GHG emissions. As noted on the screen, commercial buildings and multifamily residential make up almost 40% of the countywide GHG emissions from the 2016 report. And then you have the other categories listed there as well. Jenna, next slide, please. And when looking at the current scenario, as well as the future of Arlington County's climate, we can't forget to address the local environmental and health vulnerabilities. So due to climate change, Arlington is projected to experience more than 14 days of extreme heat over the next 30 years, which is over 105 degrees Fahrenheit. And thus, this leads to human health impacts, such as cardiovascular disease, asthma, stroke, and other chronic conditions. And regarding the environment, we'll continue to see warmer winters and also the potential for increased rainfall and flooding. Jenna, next slide, please. And lastly, under the community goals, the revitalization of underperforming and vacant buildings. So here we have referenced the county's Commercial Market Resiliency Initiative, or CMRI as it's known. You may or not be familiar with this, but it is Arlington's strategy to achieve market-based solutions and address building supply vacancy rates by specifically repositioning and converting obsolete commercial inventory. Based on the fact sheet, the commercial office vacancy rate has increased since 2019, which is in part due to the pandemic, and in return, the share of the tax base has declined. So to meet the new model of working, whether it be fully remote or hybrid, the county created CMRI 2.0 to meet those changes in the market. So we're working closely with the county's Economic Development Office to cross-functionalize CMRI and the Green Building Incentive Program, as the intent is to lower EUI, reduce carbon emissions, and economically revitalize neighborhoods. Jenna, next slide, please. And now we'll look at the history and evolution of the GBIP and industry standards. Next slide, please. So the county's Green Building Incentive Program has a rich and detailed history. So I'll provide a short summary for those who are in attendance if you're not familiar with it. It was created in 1999 and adopted by the county board shortly thereafter, and it started as a pilot program. So the purpose of this was to establish a voluntary program to incentivize private sector high-performing buildings beyond state code and Dillon rule restrictions. The original program only applied to commercial office spaces and offered up to 0.25 FAR bonus density in exchange for obtaining LEED Silver certification from the United States Green Building Council. And then in 2003, the eligibility expanded to all site plan projects. And in 2009 and in 2012, the program was reviewed and updated again with the adjustment of bonus density based on market acceptance of the LEED standard, as well as planning in correlation with the greenhouse gas reduction goals in the community energy plan. Then in 2014, there was a major update that required ongoing energy use reporting and Energy Star post-occupancy certification for offices. And then in the most recent major update in 2020, the board adopted the new policy, which requires LEED Gold certification and accounts for Arlington County baseline prerequisites and extra list items, and the increased energy efficiency performance and carbon savings. So with each update, more stringency was adopted. Jenna, next slide, please. The trending industry standards sets up the conversation for the full debrief of the proposal in the forthcoming slides. But through our analysis and benchmarking literature review of other jurisdictions, as well as insight from industry leaders regarding new sustainable technologies, updated certifications, and more, these are 4 key areas that we've targeted in the proposed GBIP update, starting with the performance-based certifications in areas such as the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, adopting a stretch code that requires a third-party certified energy rating, and in the state of New York, where they have not yet adopted the proposed update to their stretch code, but for the 2023 stretch code, NYSERDA is including a way to incorporate the Passive House standard. Next is accountability and performance standards. So this can be done through benchmarking, or via a third-party certification that is based on actual performance and not predictive modeling. And third is the design focus on passive strategies. We're seeing buildings within our climate zone that are designing and constructing passive buildings, which then in return avoids energy intensity and provides healthier and safer spaces for tenants. And lastly is the decarbonization emphasis. As we know, the most sustainable building is the one that's already built. So through adaptive reuse or existing building retrofits, one has the potential to lower its operational carbon and ultimately create less embodied carbon. Jenna, next slide, please. And this leads into the GBIP proposal. But throughout our benchmarking literature review of the program and its history, and looking towards the future of industry standards, we've noted here various key takeaways as to why we're updating the program. So for one, as mentioned prior, the private building sector accounts for 39 to 40% of all community GHG emissions. Second, buildings should continue to account for their actual operational performance, as we've acknowledged through industry studies, that certifications that use predictive energy modeling at times just intrinsically fall short for their actual energy performance of the building. And I won't read all of these here, but I'll just mention one more. In the current real estate market, the interest rates for lending have increased, and developers may now have shorter investment timelines and near-term turnovers. So the incentive for bonus density through the green building program may at times may not be persuasive because it typically prolongs profitability timelines. Jenna, next slide, please. So now let's get into the proposal, its updates, and the reasoning. Next slide, please. So first, why are we doing this? And second, what is new in the GBIP update? As I mentioned prior, the program's history for the past 23 years has been rich and detailed. It has been impactful and an influential program and has set the pace in the green building market. And as we know it, it has been mirrored by other jurisdictions, not just locally, but nationally over the past 2 decades. But as with any great program, there comes a point in time to complete a deep dive analysis on the uptake, metrics, feedback, and more, and look ahead to the future of the green building market to further advance the county's climate goals. And with the climate scenario, also new modeling, new expectations, and the gap between Virginia Building Code and the International Building Code, the timing of our outlook sped up the process to complete an update. So yes, going back, we completed an in-depth analysis of the program, and through our study, we came to the result that one, bonus density creates longer profitability timelines, and given the current market, with the interest rates on loans, that can generate shorter timelines for investment. And we also acknowledge, based on studies, additional height has the potential to create ecological, political, and social challenges. Second is the need to address the efficiency of the existing building stock in the private sector, as well as continue to address energy efficiency in new construction. And to do this leads to the third point, which is to propose a new incentive in the form of tiered financial incentives. So doing this will lead to a more streamlined approach in a way that we believe the private development community will utilize the new GBIP pathways to help further advance upon the CEP goals and fully address our climate challenges in the county. So with all that being said, what is in the new GBIP proposal? And let me preface this before I proceed. What you're about to hear in this proposal update is merely a proposal. Nothing is immutable, and we acknowledge that items may be revised based on external and internal feedback through the public engagement process and further conversations with leadership. But getting back to the summary, first, we decided to streamline the new construction options, so requiring platinum LEED certification at the two lowest tiers of FAR at 0.25 and 0.35, and requiring either ILFI zero carbon or ILFI zero energy at the 0.45 and 0.55 FAR tiers, and eliminating 0.70 FAR due to its non-market uptake. Next, we'd like to start financially incentivizing actual energy performance rather than predicted modeling. So we're proposing a new pathway under new construction called the Climate Adaptation Pathway, which uses Passive House International US, or FIAS for short, but the program's zero certification. And then we're also proposing an existing buildings pathway and an adaptive reuse pathway, both of which will have a financial incentive attached. And moreover, we're also proposing a 6-month education/training program post-county board adoption, but prior to the enforcement for industry members such as developers, building owners, contractors, subcontractors, architects, and those alike, to learn more about the process as well as the new certifications and requirements in the GBIP update. We're proposing this because we acknowledge that those within the development community may not be as familiar with certifications such as Passive House, so developing curriculum and educational sessions will hopefully curb the apprehension of pursuing a more stringent standard. And just to wrap up this portion, because what we're proposing is intensely different compared to prior iterations, we're looking at this as a 5-year pilot with the flexibility built in to adapt to the market, as well as a 5-year grant program due to those financial incentives. Next slide, please, Jenna. Here's the chart of the GBIP proposal. In the coming slides, we'll break this down into each section, but this provides a high-level summary. Starting on the left-hand column, there are 3 types of construction for this GBIP proposal. First is new construction, second is existing buildings, and third is conversion or adaptive reuse. And then each type of construction has a designated pathway. So starting with new construction, there are 2 options. The first is the traditional pathway. So this is like the current GBIP in which we're offering bonus density to incentivize private developments, but we're proposing an upgrade from LEED Gold to LEED Platinum at the lower FAR tiers, as well as updating and proposing new baseline prerequisites and extra list items. And at the higher FAR tiers, we're proposing International Living Future Institute's zero carbon or zero energy certification as 2 options in lieu of LEED. International Living Future Institute, or ILFI for short, as based on actual energy performance rather than predictive modeling, as well as requiring no combustion on site. So keeping the traditional pathway as an option for new construction will build upon and advance the carbon reduction goals of the current program. And the second option for new construction is the climate adaptation pathway. So this pathway will use Passive House International, US, or FIAS for short, but the program's zero certification. If you're not familiar with FIAS, it is today's highest building energy standard that relies on a combination of passive design concepts to immensely reduce the building's energy use intensity. And much like ILFI, this certification is based on actual energy performance and requires no combustion on site. And attached to the climate adaptation pathway is a proposed financial incentive, as well as offering 0.25 FAR. And at the start of a project, we're proposing nominal incentives that go towards the FIAS feasibility study and modeling for the project. Moving down, the second type of construction is for existing buildings. This pathway will focus on unprecedented carbon reduction potential in the county's existing commercial building stock. This pathway also financially awards projects if they meet the requirements. So to obtain this incentive, the applicant will first need to prove the building has undergone a retrofit. And then once confirmed, the project can either achieve the award through Energy Star certification or by achieving a 10% reduction in the building's energy use intensity, so whichever yields the higher score. And then finally is the third type of construction, conversion or adaptive reuse. The main reasoning behind this is the immense carbon savings from building reuse and carbon reduction in continuing operations. So this pathway will be for existing commercial buildings that are converting to residential, and we're proposing a financial incentive in 2 options. The first being a market rate award per unit, and the second is an affordable housing rate award per unit. And for both incentive options, the applicant will need to be awarded LEED version 4 Gold or LEED version 5 Silver when USGBC ballots the newest version of LEED, as well as a 25% energy use intensity reduction. Jenna, next slide, please. So now we'll start to provide more detail about each type of construction and designated pathway, starting with the traditional pathway and new construction. Next slide, please. I'm not going to reiterate each line item here, but as I mentioned in the prior slide, the traditional pathway under new construction will be like the current GBIP. The bonus density tiers remain, aside from the 0.70 FAR. And there is an upgrade to LEED Platinum from LEED Gold at the lower FAR tiers. And there is also the removal of LEED certification at 0.45 and 0.55 FAR with the replacement of the ILFI options. And then in the coming slides here, I'll provide further detail about the updated and new baseline prerequisites and extra list items. Next slide, please, Jenna. So we don't need to spend too much time on the slide since this is being used as a comparison to the next. But this is a summary chart of the current requirements in the 2020 Green Building Incentive Program at each FAR tier. So if you'd like, you can also view this in the board report for the 2020 GBIP adoption, or we can come back to this at the end if you have any questions. Jenna, next slide, please. And then here we have the summary chart of the proposed traditional pathway in red text, as well as highlighted in yellow are the updates being proposed. So again, just to reiterate, LEED Platinum or version 5 Gold, looking at ILFI Zero Energy or ILFI Zero Carbon at the higher FAR tiers, removing the 0.70 FAR tier due to the non-market uptake, and also looking at post-occupancy recommissioning at the higher FAR tiers. Jenna, next slide, please. And then here we have the updated and new proposed baseline prerequisites and extra list items. So starting at the top for EV charging infrastructure, we'll align this with the updated criteria for the LEED version 4.1 EV option 1 and option 2 for EV charging stations for at least 5% of parking spaces and EV infrastructure for at least 10% of parking spaces. For this baseline prerequisite, we're also looking at the proposed option for e-bikes, but we're monitoring this closely as USGBC revises its LEED version 5 standard. The next updated baseline prerequisite is equity, diversity, and inclusion. We're proposing an update to the language that reflects upon the county's goals, as well as the significance and importance of EDI in private real estate development. So there are 3 proposed options that a project may choose from for this prerequisite. The first option is to complete an environmental justice assessment using the building EJ tool, and then provide a narrative based on those findings and what the project team will do to assess environmental justice and social equity issues within the development surrounding area. The second option is to align with International Living Future Institute's Building Challenge Core Imperative 17, Universal Access, which essentially makes all public space on a project accessible to all members of the public, and also includes the principles of universal design for those with disabilities. And the last option is in alignment with International Living Future Institute's Living Building Challenge Core Imperative 18, Inclusion, which provides the option to donate 0.1% of the construction cost to a nonprofit organization focused on equity and inclusion in Arlington County. Moving down the list for the new baseline prerequisites, the first is a whole building life cycle assessment. So this will be in alignment with the LEED version 4.1 MR credit, option 2, path 1 for building life cycle impact reduction. So this deals with the embodied carbon of the new construction project. Next is the construction waste management. Here we're proposing that no less than 65% of non-hazardous construction waste shall be diverted from landfill. And lastly is the integrative process workshop with Arlington County Green Building staff. So here we're proposing that the project team schedule a time with staff to discuss the sustainability elements of the project at each design stage. So whether that be conceptual design, schematic design, design development, construction documents, but to have a conversation with us at each stage to discuss those sustainability elements and if anything changed. And on the right-hand side, for the new proposed extra list items, first is building electrification, fairly self-explanatory, but requiring the installation of non-combustible mechanical systems and appliances in all spaces. Second is whole building life cycle assessment, 10% reduction, so largely similar to the baseline prerequisite, but requiring a 10% reduction in global warming potential. And then the third proposed extra list item is Fitwell certification, 1 star. So Fitwell deals with the health of the occupants and the tenants involved within that building. Jenna, next slide, please. And I'll hand it off to Vicky to debrief on the remaining pathways.
Thanks so much, Paul. Good evening, everyone. Really appreciate your joining. Thank you for being here. This is the climate adaptation pathway. So to reiterate some of what Paul had said, this is based on not only FIAS Zero certification, but the second half of this, or part of it, is to meet the county's what we're calling the green infrastructure requirements, which actually include some of the existing requirements that we have for buildings such as bird-friendly design. and also light pollution reduction. I'll get into that in a minute. There are no baseline prerequisites in this pathway. We wanted to simplify it as well as make it as rigorous as possible on the performance side, especially on the carbon reduction side. What of the baseline prerequisites exists in, for example, FIAS and green infrastructure is actually quite a bit. There is a certain amount of biophilic design that will be required in the green infrastructure requirements. There was EV charging required in FIAS 0. So between these two parts of the climate adaptation pathway, there's quite a lot that will be covered. We are, and Paul, you covered this well, the new incentives for this will include not only a bit of bonus density at 0.25 FAR, but also funding for an initial feasibility study and FIAS modeling that will come to maximum of about $25,000. And then a per square foot award upon certification. So if you're a developer and you have a project, we want to encourage developers to take up this path. So the point of the modeling and feasibility study of money, grant money essentially, is that you as a developer would be able to model your development as a FIAS development, do a feasibility study before that, and see if it works out. We think that that's a good investment and that will, we hope, entice developers to follow this pathway. What you see in the table is our just very basic addition of what this would mean in terms of cost to the county. Adding up all of what I've just mentioned, the various grants for feasibility and FIAS modeling, and then the per square foot certification award. Onward, Jenna. Next slide, please. So why? It is more rigorous than LEED. It is because it relies on Passive House International US certifier. It was a third party that comes to the site, does much testing. There is a certain amount of verification that happens under this pathway that does not happen under the traditional pathway. We also hope that developers are encouraged by the absence of the baseline prerequisites. And it also integrates equity in green infrastructure. You'll see in a minute in the green infrastructure items that there is a tree canopy, a tree equity item. And then as, or even more important, these actions embodied in the climate adaptation pathway really are meant and do address local Arlington County vulnerabilities. Certainly flooding, we will require in this pathway that a certain amount of stormwater or rainwater be dealt with on site. Because of the green infrastructure requirements, this is aimed at reducing urban heat island. It's certainly true that the green infrastructure part will help with atmospheric pollution, with air pollution. The point about power outages and grid disruptions, we know from the FIAS buildings that have been built, when the power goes out, they actually remain fairly climate stable for quite a while, because part of what makes this habit of building, if you want to call it that, so powerful, is that it relies on these passive elements such as lots of insulation, fairly thick walls, an attention to solar orientation, although that's of course limited in urban areas, but and you still have requirements for moisture control, for ventilation. The folks that we've talked to, both architects and engineers and other members of the FIUS community as people that have built and used and inhabited FIUS, the indoor environmental quality is said to be quite superb. That also includes this other bullet of noise attenuation. Because of the way it is built, when your windows are closed, it is extraordinarily quiet. And then the unevenness of our green development and the need to reduce urban heat island more equitably is also something this pathway aims to address. And here, to speak to the image, this is 425 Grand Concourse. This is in the Bronx in New York City, which is in our climate region. And these are among the project teams that Paul and I spoke with. Next slide, please, Jenna. Here's more about FIUS Zero. It is aimed at reducing these loads, heating and cooling. Some studies that have been done in the last 3 years say that the cooling energy loads in our climate zone may be reduced by as much as 90%, which is extraordinary. I think 60 to 90%, 75%, figures that are, in whatever study you choose at any level, fairly impressive. It also, of course, reduces heating load, less of a consideration in our climate, but still a consideration. It does prohibit fossil fuel combustion on site. So these are electric buildings. There is a requirement for renewable energy. You do not have to have renewable energy on site, although you may. You can, in fact, use renewable energy certificates under FIUS Zero. And we think that element is important because when we get to the green infrastructure, we're part of the climate adaptation pathway. We are assuming that people may wish to use those surfaces as green surfaces. And then I've mentioned moisture design, window or fenestration performance. One has triple paned windows in FIUS buildings. There's requirements for air sealing and ventilation, certainly Energy Star equipment. Some of this is, of course, embedded in the baseline requirements in the traditional pathway. Next slide, please, Jenna. Here's this second half of the climate adaptation pathway. This is the green infrastructure pathway. You can see some of the detail, and when you have access to the document, there'll be a bit more of this there as well. We ask that developments have an equivalent either vegetated roofs, landscaped areas, or even vertical walls that would amount to 30% of the lot area. Requirements for native species for planting, as you see. A tree canopy coverage. This is where Arlington County foresters will weigh in as appropriate to the urban density of the site and the available planting area, how much of the lot area in every case should trees cover. The idea of tree equity, asking developers to contribute to an ecologically needy Arlington site that's been identified as lacking in tree canopy by contributing to the tree canopy fund that EcoAction Arlington administers. I mentioned the bioretention measures, 80% of stormwater runoff. That should help, we anticipate, with flooding and pluvial events, lighting, dark sky requirements, and then bird-friendly materials. Next slide, please, Jenna. We're asked often about incremental costs, not only of FIUS and the ILFI, but also LEED. This gives you an idea of what we're finding. we're hoping to allay developers' fears of massive cost increases. There is a cost associated with certainly learning the ropes for FIUS particularly. This is certainly done in our region. There are buildings, and you're seeing one of them, Weinberg Commons, which is an affordable housing project in Washington, D.C., that have been built to FIUS standards and that are operating successfully. But unlike New York, unlike the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, which, as Paul mentioned, has instituted this as a strong requirement, which is actually now written into law by many Massachusetts cities as being required. FIUS is required for multifamily buildings in Massachusetts. We know that the premium diminishes once you do one or two buildings, but even for your first FIUS building, it might be between 3 and 8%. You see, historically, Weinberg Commons, when it was first built, now at least 10 years ago, that incurred an 8% cost premium. And when you have some FIUS experience, you're talking about a 3 to 5% range above conventional construction. The cost centers, these are where you would spend the most money. Certainly the windows, those triple paned windows, the ultra insulating windows. Reducing thermal bridging, where you have leaks in your building envelope of walls, roofs, floors that allow heat or cooling to escape. Reducing those requires attention and expertise. But once done, one is familiar with that. This is also why it's so critical that we have that 6-month educational piece as part of this rollout, because we'll be attempting to get not only developers and members of the public if they wish to join, but also the subcontractors of developers who are important actors in making sure that these things operate as they're designed to operate. And you see the lead of incremental cost comparison there. Next slide, please, Jenna. This is a bar chart from a recent presentation of ACEEE convention. This shows you a comparison of affordable passive house buildings in Philadelphia. And you see the reductions in the KBTUs, or 1,000 British thermal units per square foot per year. That's how you get energy use intensity. And passive house is low compared with LEED, and certainly compared with either code-built buildings or buildings built to conform to code, or the median EUI of buildings that are built to conform to code. So more and more data comes out every year about FIUS and its performance. Next slide, please, Jenna. And now adaptive reuse. Next slide, please. This is the second new pathway. I mean, Paul has already gone over the traditional pathway that is now updated. Climate adaptation pathway is an entirely new pathway, and this is also new, and we're very excited about it. Vacancy of office buildings is a drain economically, environmentally, socially on our community. And so we're really hoping that by incentivizing this as a per square foot grant, that developers will take this up. We have certain requirements that they have to meet. Notably, they must retain 50% of their existing building and infrastructure to be eligible for incentives. Paul had mentioned that this is where they're again going back into the LEED universe. We're asking that they meet V4, that's the present version of LEED, at the gold level, or V5 silver. Now, those are somewhat below what we're asking under the traditional pathway because we think it is more difficult. to do these office to housing conversions. This also will be part of the educational curriculum. And we have some glimmers of developer interest already in this, which is really great. And on to the next, Jenna. This is the last new pathway, the existing buildings pathway. Next, please. Existing buildings are where our carbon emissions take flight. So we really want to give folks the chance to reduce the emissions of their existing buildings through this pathway and its incentives. And Paul covered it very well. Buildings must undertake upgrades, retrofits, and then as a result of those, based on a year's worth of energy data, achieve Energy Star certification, or if the building was already a pretty high performer, a 10% reduction in their energy use intensity, whichever yields the higher Energy Star score. So Energy Star certification, unlike some other certifications, only pertains for 1 year. So we would award incentives, at least in this draft, and as Paul also said, and I do wish to reiterate, this is all on the table for discussion. But we would renew these incentives for up to 5 years with documentation of new Energy Star certification, which involves having an Energy Star licensed professional review the energy use of the building, walk through the building, look at the systems, and more. So that is the end of the new pathways. We now have 4 pathways. 2 new construction, 1 adaptive reuse, 1 existing buildings pathways. And onward, Jenna, I'm going to turn this back over to Paul Roman. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Vicki. I'll wrap things up, starting with the summary of incentives. Jenna, next slide, please. So this reiterates and summarizes what each incentive is and for which pathway it's involved with. Again, the traditional pathway in new construction will be bonus density only, and the remainder will be financial incentives with the addition of 0.25 FAR to the climate adaptation pathway under new construction. Jenna, next slide, please. And lastly, we have community benefits and how it serves multiple priorities within the county. So for example, it replaces modeled savings with verified performance for buildings. It will lower utility bills for tenants through pathways such as the climate adaptation pathway using Passive House. And it creates healthier and resilient buildings for the community and its members. Jenna, next slide, please. Next steps in discussion. So just next slide, please. And then here we have the public engagement plan, probably fairly similar to what we've seen in the past if you've been part of public webinars or just the public comment period for the Green Building Incentive Program. We have some of the key stakeholders involved at the internal engagement level, and then the extensive public engagement, some of the key stakeholders as well there. Again, the public comment period, obviously, as part of this public engagement plan, we are going through more of these conversations internally and externally. So again, nothing is etched in stone with this proposal. It's merely a proposal, but we are considering everyone's feedback, taking their questions, their comments, and addressing them in a timely fashion. And then if there's need for any revisions, we're going back and looking at this with leadership, county board members, and follow-ups. That will be addressed as well. Next slide, please. And that does it for our briefing. So now I will open it up. As I mentioned at the beginning of this presentation, there will be a 30-minute Q&A session held for this. So if you have any questions, please feel free to raise your hand. I already see one raised. Or if you have any questions, please feel free to put them in the chat as well. Or if there's just general comments or feedback, we welcome that too.
Okay, so kicking things off, it looks like we have a raised hand. Doug, you should be able to come off your mute. If you want to just try to click unmute.
That it? There we
Yep.
go. Okay. Sorry. Thanks. I'm not used to Teams. I'm more of a Zoom guy. So I really want to thank the staff for working so hard on this. I know there's a very complex set of ideas here that are